How often have you felt restricted to spiritual practices that often seem outdated and of little relevance in today's world? Are you discouraged to express your own creative talents and develop spiritual practices that are uniquely you? The Liturgical Rebels podcast is for people like you who want to reimagine and reconstruct their faith and spiritual practices. It's for those who want to reshape belief and journey closer to God's wholeness with peace, justice, and flourishing, not just for themselves, but for the earth and all its inhabitants.
This week on Liturgical Rebels, we are repodcasting the conclusion of Earthkeepers' interview with well-known author and environmentalist Bill McKibben. James Amadon and Deb Rienstra from the Earthkeepers podcast discuss climate change, renewable energy, the role of faith communities, and practical solutions in this wide-ranging conversation. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this fascinating reflection on cultural and technological change, spiritual perspectives, and inspiring stories.
You're listening to Earthkeepers, a podcast for all of us who believe that earth care is a faith practice. In our honest conversations, you'll hear fresh perspectives and practical insights that help us to care for the planet and love our places. Friends, once again, we have the opportunity to glean wisdom from a man with enormous experience and influence in advocating for the planet. This is the second part of that conversation, the first part having taken place in the last episode. Let me recommend that you check out that episode as well if you haven't heard it yet. Our guest is well-known author, journalist, and environmentalist Bill McKibben. He has written many books over the last few decades, and personally speaking, these books have had an enormous shaping influence on my life and have inspired me to devote myself to earthkeeping in all that I do. As most of our listeners know, Circlewood works in collaborative partnership with A Rocha USA, an organization that, like Circlewood, is devoted to helping people to live into our shared calling to care for God's creation. Among other things, Circlewood and A Rocha are committed to co-creating a number of podcast episodes this year. And this episode, along with the last one, is a product of those collaborative endeavors. For that reason, the conversation with Bill McKibben will be co-hosted by my friend James Amadon, Executive Director of Circlewood, and by Deb Rienstra, writer, speaker, and professor who serves on A Rocha USA's advisory board. I should note that Dr. Rienstra, too, has been a podcast guest in the past, and I would urge you to check out my conversation with her in episode 85 of Earthkeepers. She, too, has a fantastic podcast called Refugia, in which she explores how people of faith can nurture life-giving spaces in the earth, in our human cultural systems, and in our spiritual communities. So, here we go with part 2 of our podcast conversation with Bill McKibben. In this episode, Bill challenges and inspires us by his own experiences of truth-speaking and teaching that leads people into hands-on climate action. He also helps us to understand the great advances that have taken place in renewable energy and how solar farms, for example, are helping insect pollinators to thrive, and how the submerged bits of floating wind installations are providing new habitat for a diversity of sea life. Bill also helps us to understand the responsibility of faith communities, not just to mobilize people to care for and love their places, but also to speak up about the moral corruption of governments and corporations that have mired us so deeply in our current climate crisis. Welcome, friends, to the Earthkeepers podcast.
You know, Deb and I, a lot of our work is with people of faith, trying to move the needle and trying to get people and communities to get on board from a practical and a, theological and a spiritual side. And your last chapter in Here Comes the Sun points towards this possibility to see the spiritual side, as you've mentioned, of our relationship to creation, and particularly the sun. You know, when you are working with people of faith, who might have objections or who aren't there, what do you see changing them? I mean, from the inside, because there's the technical advances that I think can help. When we put solar panels on the top of our education center at Circlewood, and I started to learn and understand and watch it work, it was like a miracle. It was like watching something out of nothing. I can't explain the spiritual dimension of solar cells, but that's not going to convince everybody. So what is it that we need to do? What is it that we all need to kind of tap into when the rational arguments aren't making it through?
We're irrational in many different ways, and we need to, think about all of them. So I've lived my whole life in rural America, deep in rural America, some of it in red state America, some of it in purple state Vermont. That means that I have lots of neighbors who have Trump flags at the mailbox and solar panels on the roof. So when I talk to them at church or at fire company or something, when we talk, I know it's not because the same reasons as I do. And I think for most of them, the sort of irrational but powerful feeling is, my home is my castle, and it's a better castle with an independent power supply. That's not why I put solar panels all over my roof. I did it about climate and creation, but I'm a good enough American that I understand exactly what they mean, and I feel the same way myself. So that's an example of a different kind of sort of visceral feeling about the world that we should definitely be appealing to people about. For those of us who live in rural areas, the fact that the land can bring forth remarkable gifts is one of the things that we really appreciate. And this is the greatest example in a lot of ways of that. I mean, we're going to have to cover 1.5 or 2% of the landscape with solar panels and wind turbines in order to generate the power that we use. Think about what a tiny percentage of our land that is for a crop this important. I mean, at the moment, we cover 30 million acres, mostly of the Midwest, with corn. Corn's our biggest crop, takes 60 million acres in this country. 30 million of those we use growing ethanol. That 30 million acres produces about 3% of America's energy. If you covered the same 30 million acres with solar panels, you'd produce about 100% of the energy that America currently uses. I mean, that's not how we want to do it. I mean, we don't want to just cover Indiana stem to stern in solar panels. And we've got lots of rooftops and stuff. We can do some of it there. But we're going to use some land, and rightly so. When we do, we don't have to pour nitrogen and phosphorus on solar panels to make them work. And you're left with half the field, the land in between the panels, which is the blank canvas for the newest sort of form of human creativity that we have. It's going under the clunky name right now of agrivoltaics, but it just means what you can do in this new landscape. What we've done a lot of in Vermont is plant pollinator-friendly weeds and flowers, and the number of pollinating insects increases by a factor of about 100 over the cornfield that was there before, because you don't have to spray these things with pesticides, That means that the surrounding farmers see a huge increase in pollination or fruit set in the orchards. And it means that we're taking a bite out of the biodiversity crisis that should be alarming us all at the same time we're dealing with the climate crisis. People love birds. It turns out that their numbers are growing dramatically in places that have solar farms because there are often big pieces of grassland that are only mowed once or twice a year. People love the diversity of life in the ocean. It turns out that the platforms for those big offshore wind turbines are turning into some of the most remarkable reefs in the world and being used by all kinds of marine life as a safe harbor nursery. The point is that we can start thinking in all kinds of new and creative and interesting ways about the world. And that in and of itself is a very spiritual thing to be doing, as opposed to just blindly trying to stick with the thing we were doing before, which is, at this point, well, it's the enemy of creation and the enemy of affordability, but it's also just stale. It doesn't use our hearts in the way that they were built to be used,
Yeah. Yeah. And, unfortunately, all of us as human beings are subject to inertia And that's definitely true in faith communities. And even, we've seen a kind of curdling of Christianity in the United States with Christian nationalism. So people of faith are not typically regarded as great participants and contributors to all of this transition and all the good things about it. What do you think could be the unique contribution, if there is such a thing, for people of faith in this broader cultural transition?
Well, people of faith always have a huge role to play in helping us understand that there's something beyond pragmatism at work in the world. I think the pragmatic arguments are sufficient probably to get us to where we should be on most of these questions, but perhaps not to move us fast enough. I think that they help us understand the existence of a certain kind of evil in the world as well. We now know that the big oil companies thoroughly investigated and found out about climate change back in the 1980s. Exxon was the biggest company in the world. They had a huge staff of scientists. Their product was carbon. Of course, they investigated it. And what they found was just what the NASA scientists were finding. Their predictions for what the temperature would be in 2020 were even closer than those NASA scientists. And within their companies, they were believed. Exxon began building all its drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level that they knew was coming, for instance. What they didn't do across the industry was tell the rest of us. Instead, they began the billion-dollar work of building this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that turned perfectly good people from believing in the obvious physics and chemistry here on each other in bad, politicized, partisan, sad ways, to the point where the president of the United States now gets on TV and says climate change was a hoax invented by the Chinese. So to get back to the question of evil, I don't have a good other word for describing what those oil companies did. They let their desire for more money control what they said, what they knew to be true. I don't have some other lens through which to understand that. And I do think that our Christian understanding of the world offers at least some lens into helping us understand that and helping us try and redeem it. I do think that people of faith have enormous part to play. And I think, obviously, at the deepest level, it stems from the fact that we have a different set of marching orders, Literally on the first page of the book, and it's one of those books that people tend to read the first page of more than the rest, we were told that our job was to safeguard creation. God had done this work that he was quite proud of. This is very good. Look, I'm handing it over to you. Your job is to take care of it. And we've done a poor job. In the gospel, it's pretty clear that our basic job is to love our neighbor, not to starve our neighbor, not to make it so hot they can't grow food, not to flood our neighbor out, to love our neighbor. So right now, a solar panel is like a peace symbol, and it's like a symbol of love to everyone around us. And I always smile when I go by a church and see the roof of that church covered in solar panels. I think there's a church that's figured out, A, how it's going to pay the pastor's salary with the savings off its electric bill, but B, has figured out that it plays a role inside the walls of the church and literally outside the walls of the church too.
Hey friends, Forrest again, just popping in to make a quick comment. Hopefully this conversation is challenging you to consider just how powerful it can be when people mobilize around common beliefs and act out of core convictions of faith. If you want to learn more about how people of faith are making a difference in the world, we've got a podcast you should check out. It's called Think Global, Do Justice, hosted by Brandon Stiver. Each episode brings you into conversations with leaders from around the world that are working in missions, global development, and human rights. You'll hear from organizations like World Relief, Convoy of Hope, and Cure International, as well as thought leaders like Eugene Cho, Ruth Padilla-de Borst, and Ellen Hirsch. From orphan care and community development to peace building and nonprofit leadership, every episode invites you into meaningful conversations that matter. So have a listen to Think Global do justice wherever you get your podcasts. For now, let's get back to our Earthkeepers conversation.
Yeah, I'm wondering, thinking about those simple choices, practical choices, whether it's investing in solar panels or an EV, planting pollinator gardens. I mean, all those solutions are readily available for all of us. And there's lots of training. There's really no excuse to pursue them on an individual and a small community level. But when it comes to things like your description of what big oil has done over the years, when people think about climate change and these big issues, it's really easy to feel like it's too big. And I'm wondering if you would take us through how your work of organizing, especially right now through Third Act, helps address that kind of feeling and issue.
It is too big. The American impulse default is always towards individual action. Those are perfectly good. I'm happy I have solar panels on the roof and an EV in the garage. But we're not going to solve this crisis one vegan dinner at a time, one Tesla at a time. The important role for individuals is to be less individuals and to join together with others in movements big enough to make change happen. Change in the basic economic and political ground rules that then shift how things come out. That's why we build things like Third Act. So Third Act started 4 years ago with the recognition that there were a lot of us over the age of 60, and that we've had this idea in our society that political change was the work of young people. But in fact, if you think about it, older people have skills built up over a lifetime and a network of friends and family built up over a lifetime, and they have time, and they have a new set of concerns about legacy. Once you're nearer the exit than the entrance, you start thinking a little more about what you're going to leave behind. Your legacy is the world you leave behind for the people you love the most. And we're in danger of being the generation that leaves the world in considerably worse shape than we found it, our country and our world. And that's a bad legacy. So we started Third Act to protect the climate and the democracy. We thought those were the two things under the most unique threat. And it's been great fun. We have about 120,000 volunteers around the country and big working groups in most states. They've been very effective. One of the dirty secrets of state and local government is that 500 or 600 people in a state are enough to be very, very powerful lobby because so few people bother to take seriously a local and state government. They're doing beautiful work at the moment. This Simplify Solar project is a big part of what they're up to, working on solar reform and plug-in solar. And that's why we have these laws now in state after state after state. But they also work hard on democracy. We've just been doing this series of videos with some of our very oldest members in their 90s and 100s, people really too old to get out in the street and demonstrate and things for the most part, but who want to be a part of ongoing change. And I started interviewing them because I was struck by the recognition that as we celebrate our 250th birthday as a country this year, that if you're 83 or older, you've been around for more than a third of American history, which I think gives you a certain credibility to talk about the moment that we're in. And so what they're saying over and over again in these videos is how odd and different this moment is. I mean, look, everybody, no matter what their politics, has had presidents they liked or didn't like or whatever. But I don't think there's ever been a moment like the one we're in now where people are just ripping up all the rules and all the norms and all the things that we're used to. There's definitely never been a moment when the President of the United States decided to tweet out a picture of himself as Jesus. I'll tell you that. The just sheer blasphemy of the moment that we live in is enormous. But the videos these older people were doing were very powerful. There's a woman who said, When I was 4, I watched my sister die of polio. Can I tell you how mad it makes me to see them messing around with public health? The guy who said, I took my commission in the Navy shortly after Pearl Harbor. Can I tell you how mad it makes me to see the president treating so lightly our troops and talking about how fun it is to bomb Iran and things like that? So on all counts, I think older people have a significant role to play. And part of that role is backing up younger people. On these questions of climate, there's been a lot of talk about how anxious young people have become, climate anxiety. When I talk to younger people, and I've spent much of my life organizing with younger people, my feeling is that they're less likely to be anxious about the climate itself than about the idea that they've been left to deal with it on their own, which I'm afraid is essentially true. And so we're very eager to change that. At any rate, it's been very good organizing, and it offers an easy home. Most of them have never done anything like this in the course of their lives because they've been busy having kids and having jobs and, doing what they're doing. And of course, because they're that age, a great many of them grew up going to church, So it definitely has some echoes of that as well.
Yeah, we have 2 rather personal questions to end up with here. And one of them works beautifully as a segue to what you were just talking about. You have been doing this work for a long time. You've seen a lot of setbacks over the years, a lot of discouraging developments. What would you suggest to younger people about how to pick yourself up after a discouragement?
Well, it's a good question. I think people of faith are allowed to hope that there are some forces in the world that'll meet you halfway. I think it's the opposite of being allowed to think that God will take care of problems, I think that's the worst theology that there ever was. But if we're allowed to think that if we do everything we possibly can, then it's an interesting world where the Holy Spirit is at work, and who knows? And I find that a little comforting. And I spend a lot of time, as much as I can, less than I want to, in the world outdoors. Because one of our jobs as the animal that can bear witness is just to bear witness to how beautiful this planet, even in its current damaged state, is. And that really is one of our roles in the world, is to be conscious of that and to celebrate it and to thank God for it. So I do every day.
Yeah, it leads right into my final question for you. You'd written towards the end of the book, Here Comes the Sun, that activists, people working for change, doing this kind of work, are extremely bad at one thing, and that's celebrating. And I can relate because the work that I do is it's always what's next? And yep, you get a win and you move on to the next. And, it's almost like a discipline to stop and celebrate with one another. So thinking both on a big scale and also with you personally, Bill, what are you celebrating right now?
I'm lucky. I finally have a grandson, and he lives right nearby. So we have the kind of daily celebration of watching him grow into the world and start to understand and be conscious of things. And that's extraordinarily fun. And it also comes with the burden of loving someone who will, with luck, be alive in the 22nd century. And, hence all the more reason to be working hard now to make that century a possibility. But I think in general, yes, celebration is a good idea. And it's one of the things that the Christian liturgical calendar is pretty good at. A reminder that we need regular times to celebrate those who have done great things, the saints that came before us, and the great moments of the liturgical year. And the only day that I preach in our local church is on Christmas Eve. I always do the Christmas Eve service. And because we're a tiny town up in the high mountains, we always, after we've sung Silent Night, fling open the door and ring the bell and go out singing Go Tell It on the Mountain, because it seems appropriate for where we are. And it's one of my favorite hymns or carols that there ever was, just because it's so exuberant and so celebratory. So there you are.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly been a wonderful thing to celebrate to be with you, Bill. And thank you for your work. Thank you for your voice, for your absolutely relentless work in this area, and your faithfulness as well.
Thanks, both of you, and what a pleasure to get just say thanks for the work that you all do on a regular basis. It's important to all of us, and keep it up.
So, friends, that was the second part of our conversation with author Bill McKibben. Check out our show notes if you want to know more about him and what he's up to these days. You know, for me, the most provocative thing Bill said in this part of the conversation is that there is a role for everyone to play in the larger endeavor to save the planet. Implicit in the stories he tells is the message that none of us can afford to sit back and trust others to do the work for us. To that point, Bill makes it clear that if any age group has the time, experience, and resources to invest in working for lasting environmental justice, it's the over 60 crowd. Indeed, I would contend that older generations don't just have greater capacity to work for the health of the planet. Many would contend that they bear more of the responsibility for the damage that's been done, and investing themselves in Earth advocacy could be seen as an opportunity to help right past mistakes. In any case, if you know someone who you think would be interested in becoming an agent of change, working in community with others, please send them a link to this episode, and maybe even point them to the organization Bill helped start called Third Act, a group that harnesses generational power to help safeguard our climate and our democracy. If you were inspired by Bill's challenges as I was, another great place to start exploring practical ways to get involved is to check out another organization that he helped found, one aimed at all age groups called 350.org, a global grassroots climate campaign which has organized protests to promote climate action on every continent, including Antarctica. You might also check out opportunities with our partner organization, A Rocha USA, represented in this conversation by Deb Rienstra, who is on their advisory board. Check out our show notes for other resources that we recommend when it comes to collective action and community organization for the good of the planet. The Earthkeepers podcast is a production of Circlewood. Our executive producer is James Amadon, and our sound engineer is Dave Wolfers. Jesselyn Gentry is our communications manager, and our music was created by Forrest Reed and Levgen Potovsky. I am Forrest Dinsley, your podcast host, and I'm really grateful for the time you've spent listening to this episode. Help us expand our reach by following or subscribing to this podcast on your favorite listening platform, and be sure to go to earthkeepers.online to sign up for our podcast newsletter. If you know someone who would benefit from hearing this podcast conversation, it would be great if you could send them a link. In any case, I hope you'll join us again for our next episode of the Earthkeepers podcast.
Thank you for joining us for part 2 of this fascinating discussion with Bill McKibben. Thanks, too, to the Earthkeepers podcast for permission to re-podcast this interview. For the next few weeks, we will be re-podcasting our Celtic spirituality interviews, starting with Christine's interview with Tom about their joint experiences of Celtic spirituality. As many of you know, Christine's beloved Tom passed away last week, so we will be taking a much-needed and somewhat overdue break from presenting new material. Thank you for your patience and your prayers in this time. You can connect with Christine Sign on her Substack page, Walking in Wonder, or on Instagram or Facebook.